From the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, this is Glenn Fulcher with another issue of Language Testing Bytes. Issue 27.4 of Language Testing contains an article by Carol Chappell and colleagues entitled Towards a Computer-Delivered Test of Productive Grammatical Ability. This is one of many papers that's being published at the moment on the assessment of grammar, and we thought that this would be an excellent opportunity to look at what's going on in the testing of grammar and to try and get an overview of the field. We turned to Jim Purpura, who is Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York, and also the author of Assessing Grammar, published by Cambridge University Press in 2004. I telephoned him in his office in New York, and we apologise for any of the noise in the background. New York can, of course, be a very noisy, if exciting place. Jim, welcome to Language Testing Bytes, and thanks for agreeing to talk to us about assessing grammar.
Oh, I'm very happy to do it. This is a great thing you guys are doing, Glenn.
Well, thanks, Jim. Teaching and testing grammar have been out of favour for quite some time, but over the past few years I've noticed that it's starting to come back into fashion. And this reminded me of something Alan Davis wrote in an article in Language Teaching, in the early 1980s. And I just want to read you one of the quotations from that. And what Alan said was, "What remains a convincing argument in favour of linguistic competence tests, both discrete and integrative, is that grammar is at the core of language learning. Grammar is far more powerful in terms of generalizability than any other language feature. Therefore, grammar may still be the most salient feature to teach and to test." Jim, do you think Alan Davis was, and still is, right?
Well, yeah, I do think Alan was and still is right, actually. I mean, as I've said in many of my talks, grammar is really it's the critical linguistic resource for communication. And so without that piece, we don't have language really except for sign language. So, I do believe that's true. Also, more recently, Glenn, there's been a number of studies that really provide convincing evidence that the relationship between grammatical knowledge and performance is a very strong predictor. Grammatical knowledge is a very strong predictor. I mean, in the old days, McNamara in 1990 and his colleagues did some research on looking at the relationship between grammatical resources and speaking, and that was a strong relationship. More recently, there's been some very sophisticated articles on grammatical knowledge and reading, and Yoko Damerik's dissertation, or Alec Liao's dissertation on grammatical knowledge and reading and listening, Kirby Grabowski's on pragmatic knowledge, and Jiwa Dakin's dissertation on the relationship between grammatical knowledge and social studies knowledge, and it goes on and on. So for those who reject the notion that grammar is important or shouldn't be assessed in some way on tests, I really don't understand where they're coming from, because for me this is the heart and soul of language ability. So yeah, I agree with Alan.
Well, and your own approach to assessing grammar as it's evolved is kind of very different from what we think of as the traditional multiple choice discrete type structure items. And in issue 27.4 of the journal, the current issue of Language Testing, Carol Chappell and her colleagues begin their paper with a quotation from your widely acclaimed 2004 book entitled Assessing Grammar, and that's taken from page 37, in which you particularly criticise, and I quote here, scoring rubrics with descriptions of grammatical development that have little support from SLA findings. Well, it seems to me that second language acquisition research generally offers language testers very little that we can actually use in designing language tests, with the one exception of the acquisition of grammar, from groundbreaking studies like those of Pieneman back in the 1980s, and even before that with the morpheme acquisition research. How do you think this evidence can be used in the assessment of grammar?
Well, I think it can be used, and I think there's information on developmental sequences, as you know, and also in the morpheme studies that can be used for general understandings about how people acquire certain grammatical features. And people have used this in tests. I mean, Jihak Chang's study looked at relative clauses and how we could use these features, you know, the information from SLA, and how we can design tests that relate to that. And then, you know, as far as so we can use the morpheme studies, we can use developmental sequences in terms of sequencing certain items. But the problem with with the SLA studies is that first of all, there aren't very many features that they've looked at. In the grand scheme, they haven't looked at very many features. Now, in Carol's article with her colleagues, she put in a number of extra features that I haven't seen in studies before. But the problem with all of these studies is that first of all, they're not drawing on a comprehensive model of grammatical knowledge. So as a result, there are issues of representativeness and coverage. So my question in looking at that study and some of the other studies that use SLA research is, how do we know that these features are the best features that we should be testing? And so, on the one hand, I'd like to say that we need to look at SLA research and try to understand, you know, how they've looked at these sequences and the orders and what they've found. But we have to understand that this is not the be-all and end-all. There's a whole lot more research that needs to be done, basic research that needs to be done, in order for us to be able to use this research to assess grammatical knowledge in a much more comprehensive way. And so what I was trying to accomplish in my book was to provide at least some kind of a beginning of a comprehensive framework where that would allow us to know that we're not just focusing, for example, on morphosyntactic forms, but there are a number of other types of forms that need to be accounted for. And just as importantly, we can't overlook the research that now there's been almost 20 years of research on form meaning mappings. And for us to go back to think that it's only about syntax and is just you know, wrong-minded as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of the SLA research is really focused on morphosyntax. So even though we should consider what has been done in SLA, I think we need to go way beyond that and think more about how some of these forms relate to their meanings, and meanings that even might go beyond literal meaning or semantic meaning, but meanings that are used pragmatically. So, yeah, there's more and more research in SLA, and I just don't think we can completely ignore that, but we need to use it judiciously.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to actual items that we use to assess grammar, however we define that, it's clear that you would prefer not to rely entirely upon multiple choice items anymore. And Chappell and colleagues in this month's issue recommend items like gap filling, jumbled word order, and form changing items. When it comes to the variety of item types that we can use in our tests to assess grammar, are we currently going anywhere innovative? I mean, do you see anything new on the horizon?
Well, you know, first of all, I didn't say in my book that I preferred any kind of items. I don't think. I'm sure I didn't. What I was trying to say in the book was that I don't think we should have value judgments about item types. In other words, depending on the context of assessment and what exactly we're trying to get at, we should freely be able to use any kind of, you know, selected response, limits production, or extended production tasks in order to elicit grammatical knowledge. So I don't think that I would say that we should not do multiple choice. That in certain circumstances, that is the way that's how we might want to elicit that knowledge. But again, I there are, and then Carol used a bunch of limited production tasks in this, and I don't think in the end, Glenn, to answer your question, that there's all that much that's innovative in terms of item types that I've seen so far. I think that we could be more innovative in that respect if we were going to use the full capacity of computers. But in what I've seen so far, and including in the Oxford test that I've worked on, as you know, we have been using just these very traditional item types, and we've just been putting them on the computer. But what I think we could do is look at issues of visual media and context, and try to elicit grammatical knowledge from students in a much more interesting way by means of providing them with rich context delivered over the computer. So I think that's a way to go in terms of item types. But I don't think what's innovative so far is that. I think what is innovative, though, is how we're thinking about scoring the actual performance that we're seeing. And Carol has used a rating scale model in terms of doing that, where she has a 0 to 2 scale. But there's some other ways of looking at that also. Carol basically and her colleagues, they basically looked at morphology and syntax, and they kind of played around with meaning a little bit, but meaning really isn't explicit. So basically, the way they scored this was really on morphosyntax. But I think there's a different dimension here that, especially with the limited production task, that could be scored, and that is the meaning that's being conveyed and the extent to which meaning is conveyed in those items. So there's, so in terms of scoring, we can look at scoring in some very different ways. We could look at the way Carol did in terms of rating scales, or in terms of what Pieneman did or suggested, and Rod Ellis suggested in terms of developmental scores, where you take information from SLA and then give scores based on those stages, or I think another way of doing this is what Bachman and Palmer suggested, was to look at right-wrong scoring, but using multiple criteria for correctness when the construct that's being elicited suggests there are different dimensions. And in Carol's data, for me, the construct being elicited is multidimensional. There's a form dimension and there's a meaning dimension. And unfortunately, in the study, I mean, I don't want to criticize the study too much because I really liked it, but I think there was an opportunity lost in the study in that they only got very ambiguous information from the scores, where they could have gotten information on the students' knowledge of forms, and also their ability to convey those meanings associated with those forms. So I think the scoring is the more innovative aspect of what's happening in grammatical assessment.
Well, from what you just said, and indeed from your recent work, I mean, what you're doing is bringing the focus to the meanings that are associated with grammatical choice, and you've brought to testing, I think, in your work, some of the really critical insights from applied linguistics, going back to the work of grammarians. Halliday and Sinclair spring to mind. But of course, applying it, as you indicate, is where the devil creeps in. If we focus on meaning, someone might say that we're assessing pragmatic competence rather than grammatical competence, or an ability, say, to detect illocutionary intent or something like that. But we know that grammatical choice is bound up with being able to communicate with appropriate illocutionary intent in pragmatically suitable ways. And I guess, as we're coming to the end of the podcast now, I suppose what I'd really like to ask you, what I'd like to know is how you see language testers coping with this kind of complexity and still being able to say that they're assessing grammar.
That's a really good question. But I just want to begin by saying that we're always measuring grammatical, semantic, and pragmatic competence to some extent, and whether we do this explicitly or implicitly. From the moment that we begin using language, we are assessing forms, meanings, and extensions of those meanings, as long as we have some context that allows us to do that. That's one piece of the answer. So another piece of the answer is that when there's a lot of evidence now that shows that second language learners learn form and meaning differentially. In most cases, they acquire meaning before they acquire form. And so since we acquire them differently, this tells me that there seems to be two things happening here, and that we should take account of this. So, and this is normal, I think, because, the goal of communication, in my view, is to convey meaning. So when the meanings we want to convey are pretty simple, then we can use simplified forms as resources of communication. For example, if you say, I know wanting potatoes, and I say that in Greek, and I'm able to say that in Greek, where I have almost no knowledge of Greek, I would be really, really happy by saying, I know wanting potatoes in a restaurant, and they would understand me. And the way I feel is that I should get some credit for being able to communicate my meaning, even though the forms I'm using are obviously not accurate. So why not give credit for the ability to convey semantic meaning rather than the ability to convey semantic meaning accurately? Of course, this depends on the purpose of the test and the context of the assessment and all that, but I'm arguing here that we should consider this. If we want to convey those subtle meanings, or meanings that convey basically how academic we are, then obviously we need to draw on grammatical resources that are probably more precise and possibly more complex, and that exhibit maybe a wider range of structures that we're able to use. In this case, we need to recognize, that there's complexity to it, and we'll need to assess that in a different way. But from the moment that we use grammar, whether it's forms on a phonological, lexical, morphosyntactic level, we almost always map these forms onto meanings. And I say almost always because there are only a few exceptions in the language where I think a form doesn't have a meaning associated with it. For example, when we say, what time is it? The it, that expletive it, I really can't figure out what kind of meaning that has, except for a syntactic, need in our particular language group. But 99 times out of 100, we're going to have forms that are associated with these meanings. So even though we think we're not measuring meaning, we actually are measuring meaning, and we learn these meanings differentially. So I would argue that we need to begin looking at this. And consider it from day one. I mean, you can. If someone asks you, for example, in a restaurant, what can I get you? And you say, I'd like a chicken salad, for example. Well, that meaning associated with I'd like a chicken salad is very clear, very literal. There's no inference that needs to be made, and so you're getting here both form and the meaning. And meaning on these two different dimensions. And you can have all different types of varieties of, I like chicken salad, I want chicken salad, I liking chicken salad. By the same token, if you say, would you like tea or coffee? And you respond, well, coffee would be great, thanks. Then in that case, basically the relationship between that question and response isn't very direct. It's direct enough that from this context we understand what we're saying. But the response to would you like tea or coffee is, yes, I'd like coffee, and not coffee would be great. Coffee would be great adds a different dimension into the meaning here. By the same token, if you say, for example, in a service encounter, can I help? Or you say to someone, let's say, can I talk to you? And they say to you, I have a meeting now. What you're really getting at here is you're getting at forms, all these forms here that asking of a question, but the response, I have a meeting now, is really not a direct answer to that question. Can I talk to you? Well, the answer would be yes. Where you have to, here you have context that the meaning is, no, you can't talk to me right now. I have a meeting. I have something else to do. So that there's an extension of the meaning of I have a context where we are getting at pragmatic knowledge here. And this is on a very, very low level, and you'll see these in all different types of tests. Whereas what people think they're measuring, grammatical knowledge, but they are to some extent, they are of course, they're measuring grammatical knowledge, but they're also measuring pragmatic meanings here. Or better yet, if you say, can I talk to you? And someone says, whatever, then, think of all the types of meanings that are being elicited by just that one word. And again, you wouldn't necessarily you might see this on a test, but we do this at the very basic levels of language learning to the very advanced levels of language learning. So I would argue here that, we have to include the meaning dimension with all kinds of assessment of grammatical ability. It's just, it's part of that construct, and that's what I was trying to do in that model. I would rethink that model a little bit now, but still, basically, I still believe in that idea, and a lot of the research now in SLA is showing the four meaning dimensions are really important. So that was a long-winded answer to your question. Sorry.
No, Jim, thanks for giving us this insight into what is a fascinating area of language testing assessment. And I think we're certainly going to see a lot more published in this area in the coming years. So it's really great to have your take on it. And we thank you for putting it all into context for us. And thank you for joining us on Language Testing Bytes.
Oh, I'm very happy. Thank you for having me, Glenn.
Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bytes. Language Testing Bytes is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bytes through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So, until next time, we hope you enjoy the current issue of Language Testing.